Sean Hocking, welcome into the weeds, mate. A real privilege to have you on the pod.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. It's very nice to be here and talk about what I do when you ask me what I'm going to be talking about.
Well, it is not just a thing you do. You do, and you have done so many things. A really interesting cat. You've got a long history of being a provocateur, raconteur.
Well, thanks for describing me as a provocateur. I hope that works. And because the idea is sometimes you have to wind people up to get them to pay attention and
do things
in this world.
You're a promoter, you're a creator, you're a creator as well as a curator. Where did your passion for new ideas, for getting out new music, new ideas, provoking that in the community, where did that come from? Tell us about your background.
My background, I mean, in terms of provoking people, I think that's just in my nature. I've always done that since I was young. But in terms of this and in terms of cannabis, it's simply I was in the world of legal publishing, actually just up the road in Phillip Street for a long time. Coming in 2015, and this is the sort of the birth story. I ended up in Portland, Oregon by default, and I was getting very bored about writing about law. I mean, I write also about law, technology, human rights, and all that sort of stuff. But I've been a big weed fan since I was first smoked at age 14 or whatever, and I could see that in my business I was getting bored, and that people in publishing weren't going to cover law and cannabis. Everybody was into business, money, cannabis, business, making money, but nobody was actually going to talk about what the crux of cannabis is. It was just like creating relevant law policy. So I just started writing about it.
And that's the Cannabis Law Report, the Cannabis Law Journal.
2015.
So your expertise was in writing about law and how we manage some of these difficult issues.
And just recording it, literally, because a lot with cannabis, and I'm sure this is your experience, and I know it's an experience in Australia, is a lot of knowledge is created in the 1950s, 1960s, 90s, but it just disappeared into the ether unless you knew which secondhand bookshop to go to in Darlinghurst to find the set of esoteric books in the back corner on the third shelf about weed. So it was really important when it started coming in statewide in the UK. All that stuff is there, but nobody was putting it in one place. And I don't particularly organize it at the moment, but that's something we can talk about because I'm about to do that. But I just wanted to have a place where everything went and it was as global as possible.
It is, and it's an amazing resource because, and what's really interesting about what's happening with cannabis, there's just this emergence. It's always been there, cannabis through societies around the world. It's been underground, but now it's emerging back into culture and into back into the attention of legislatures, the courts.
Yeah, and that has to be defined.
Yeah.
And of course, after I was doing it for only 24, 36 months, you could see the same people making the same mistakes that somebody else had made 8 months before somewhere else. And it was funny because I was in Portland from 2015, but I returned to Sydney in 2018, 2019 maybe, where the conversation had been around, but it was just picking up. And it was like it was like being in some sort of time machine. I just walked back 3 years and I heard the same conversations and the same people saying the same right things and the same wrong things and the same misunderstood things. But there was nowhere for people to see that other people already had these discussions except for me. And at that time, nobody really knew I existed. So it's sort of interesting. And, I was writing this morning about Germany, just picking up more. It's exactly the same conversation as here. It's exactly the same conversation as Colorado in 2015.
Just in time, a difference in time.
But unless you record it all and then organize it and present it to people, because as you know, especially the younger ones, they're hopeless at research these days, even though they've got the best research tools in the world. Unless you present it to people, they just don't understand it. We're sort of I just call it sort of a hamster wheel of stupidity sometimes.
Well, it feels like that, and we're to mix up our metaphors. We reinvent the wheel when there's other places that are well down.
Australians are wonderful at doing that as well.
I know.
It's like they do not believe other people's research has been one of my bugbears for years.
Yeah.
And so, the University of Queensland has to badly create some research paper that they've already done at MIT or Harvard or Oxford or wherever on the planet. And it's pointless. I mean, I know a lot of it is organized to be can kicking, but at the same time, it just drives you crazy because it's all there.
If you want to get the reform done and the roadblock is, we need to get the information. Well, let's find it's out there. And we're finding that with the issue of roadside drug testing in this state, which is a massive inhibition for people taking up medicinal cannabis. It's a prohibition measure, not a road safety measure. And we've got all these bureaucrats and quangos.
Are they asking New South Wales, specifically educational institutions, to create research on the back of research that's been done 1,000 times already?
Essentially, yes. So we've got the government agency saying, let's go out to our tertiary institutions in this country. So there's some great work being done at at Sydney University in Swinburne. But
it's already been done in Victoria. It's already been done in WA. It's already been badly done in Queensland.
And we can also point to it being done in the United States.
Yeah.
And that's one of the interesting things. Because it was legalised in the cannabis, legalised in the US at a state level, you've got about, I think you're up to about 30 different models for cannabis legalisation.
Research is there.
But they're all different.
Yeah.
That they all deal with it differently.
Just a little bit different.
Just a little bit differently. But so just tell us about, so you started collating it. Where are we up to? Like, what's the global picture? Because you've just conducted a symposium here in New South Wales the who's who of cannabis in the country coming together. Tell us about what's happening globally in cannabis. Is it inexorable? Are we moving inexorably to a global legal cannabis market? Where are we up to?
Yes, we are, but we're doing it very badly, and we're doing it based around money, not cannabis, which is why I've created this, what I'm calling an initiative now, and set of symposiums. So I've actually just held my first policy conference in Johannesburg this year. I've now set up an arrangement with the University of Cape Town to do the same thing for the next 5 years. With Cape Town linked in with the website, I'm creating a law and social sciences research hub to put all that information, organize it properly, and people can access it from anywhere on the planet for free. Because I think what's happening is every time a new jurisdiction opens up, so say I was writing about Germany this morning, for the money people, it creates a mini gold rush. And all we're doing is chasing mini gold rushes. And we haven't thought about we have thought about foundational policy for cannabis, but then we've just either ignored it or they're just like happy, wellness type words that can go in one ear and out the other ear. So we are on an inexorable change, but that nobody has really decided how that change should happen at global level. Politicians generally don't want it to happen. The cannabis industry, the hemp, all aspects
they don't want
of
it to happen until there's that bucket of money in front of the donkey, and now it's the bucket of money that they're chasing. Of money.
So all these.
So what are the foundation? I think we have what do you think are the foundational tenets that make for good cannabis law reform? If you had to sit down and design good cannabis law reform for a jurisdiction, say New South Wales, what are the key things we've got to do?
I would put these things on an equal playing field. So I would start with general health, which is a big discussion. I think criminology-based, which has dropped out of the discussion, especially with regard to younger disadvantaged populations all over the planet who obviously can access weed really easily without even thinking about it. They don't even bother thinking that it's illegal. And somehow beginning to manage that side of things and then working out that it's an agricultural product, not a manufactured product. And then finally, the distribution, which is what everybody's obsessed by at the moment in terms of making money, the indoor growing, all those things associated with it, the testing, the dispensaries,
all
the money stuff. And, and then all this other stuff that leaks into society. And the main discussion at the moment, obviously, as you mentioned earlier, is the driving thing. But to be honest, people make a big hoo-ha out of that because there's a quadrillion prescription drugs that are going to be doing, and they're not having that level of discussion about those prescription.
Well, let's
drugs.
unpack those couple of elements. So health, you started with health. What is it like? The health we talk about, like we should deal with this through a health lens. So what does that mean when people?
It means a general holistic look at cannabis and understanding that introducing cannabis into a regulated environment, health, equity, and human rights in terms of personal use, and those should be the core of understanding what cannabis is. Essentially, that's what the discussion's been for the last 100 years. It's just that, no, you can't have that stuff because we've decided, whoever we are, have decided you can't. So I think that's really, really, and I've started these conferences because I don't know the answers to these things entirely. I really, my job is to ask questions and then be a little bit annoying when people say stupid things. But I do think health and human rights are really where we start the conversation, and then it unravels from there.
So is it a good place to start, like we have in Australia and they have in the United States and other places, to start with medicinal cannabis, like a regulated medicinal cannabis?
This is where I actually did. I think.
Or is it better to jump into an adult use market?
Well, I think we need to jump into. People have divided cannabis into medical and adult use, but they've decided medical first, not to regulate it, and then we'll let you know what adult use is further down the line. I don't think you can do that. I think you have to say cannabis is a thing. Now, okay, let's regulate it for A and for B, and then we can make amendments to understand when science begins to understand what is because whatever you want to think about it, it's a mixture of everything. It's a mixture of this and it's a mixture of that. And, words will never be able to define that exactly. So I really do think that we need to, it's interesting. In the States at the moment, they're talking about a One Plant Alliance. I deal a lot with guys like Steve D'Angelo, the founder of Medical Cannabis. And they've seen it all being sliced and diced. We have to start with the one plant, say this is a legal plant and we need to regulate it for health and human rights. And then once we have done that, we can start playing with the amendments. And okay, what is medical cannabis if everybody's allowed to use it and grow it at home? And then that industry or pharmaceutical industry or the cannabis pharmaceutical industry or whatever subsets they have created over the last 15 years can then start to really work out what medical cannabis is. Because a lot of people are going to use cannabis for pleasure and medicine at the same time. And they don't need to be involved in that world where a cannabis strain or a gene has been identified to fix your big toe. They're two different things. So I think, but I don't think you can start with medical cannabis and then say what cannabis is afterwards.
You have to do it holistically.
Because people have done that for the last 10 years and it hasn't worked, has it?
No.
All it's done is created markets more than anything else. And for me,
these arbitrary lines which don't line up with reality, which is if I'm taking medicinal cannabis to relax and feel good and unwind and, and ostensibly that's recreational or relaxational cannabis, it's still having a medicinal impact on me. If physiologically it's doing the same things, it's reducing stress. It might not be, I might not be taking it for back pain or for, elevated levels of anxiety or whatever it is. But it might just, it's still essentially like the Venn diagram. It's still
agree.
right in the middle.
And I think a perfect example is the narrative of Australian medical cannabis at the moment and the way that the system is set up. But the reality is there is green buds coming out of warehouses in Canada that were going to be sold to dispensaries as adult use cannabis. it gets put in a big bag, flown across the Pacific, and it lands here, and it gets taken out and put in little bottles with little labels, and miraculously, it's medical cannabis. So that's the perfect narrative to explain that there is no difference between the two, except for
the label.
The label. That's exactly it. And I have no problem with the label, but the label needs to start defining itself, and it can't define itself until it knows what the whole is. I mean, that's the world we live in. The discussions we have all the time about culture. It's all about understanding holistic culture. So in terms of Australia, it's all about understanding colonialism and the holistic history of this country. And then once you understand that, you can start, unlike the Liberals, you can start splitting it down and understanding the components that Australia is made of.
It's really interesting. Australia, in terms of its colonial past, has a long history of, when it comes to gold rushes, literally gold rushes. And what they do, there's a thing, and the first thing they decide is who's going to get rich.
Yeah.
And then they decide when they're going to release it and how they're going to release it. The first thing they decide is, who gets rich from it. And we've seen this rush into...
But this is the same for the last 250... Look, I was born in Australia. I grew up in the UK. I came to Australia when I was 18, 19. I started working in Phillip Street. I went to a very nice posh English public school. I didn't understand what an elite was until I came to Australia, because I knew some people... I knew a couple of friends from school in England who were from Sydney. So obviously they're from the Sydney, New South Wales elite. And it took me about 18 months, and I really understood, how 4 or 5 families can carve up each state and control. I think that has loosened a little bit, but there's new elites. But what really interests me about cannabis is the same story with Australia. Okay, let's have 3 companies or 3 families or 3 organizations. We'll basically run the whole thing. And the best thing is, let's not develop anything local, because that costs a bit of money. Let's just buy it in cheap and flog it off expensive, because they can't get it any other way. And that applies to any product within the Australian market over the last 200 years. People have done very well out of that. Thank you very much.
Look at gold or sheep or nickel or gas or whatever it is.
Clothing. I mean, it really is all. And I was a bit sad when I saw cannabis follow the same path, basically.
Well, we're here to do something about that. And one of the second element you raised, which was human rights and criminology, because you've basically got, in terms of equity, you've got a middle class system where you can get on medicinal cannabis if you've got the wherewithal and the cash to get online, go through the process, talk to your telehealth professional, get it, your little pot. Or if you're from working class, regional, you're black, all the rest, you're still going down and seeing Skinny Dave to get a stick.
Yep.
And you're facing criminality because of that. It's the same thing in the bag, probably the same reasons you're getting it, but there's these arbitrary lines. So talk to us about where you were saying the human rights and the criminal element.
I followed from in the US state by state, and every conversation was introduced by the word equity and how we're going to get people out of prison and how we're going to do this and how we're going to do that. States set up the legislation, they set up the regulation agencies, they put people in charge of equity. They talked rubbish for about 8 months, and then they went into the private sector.
Yeah.
I see that beginning to happen. These other markets are much smaller, so they're a microcosm of that. But a perfect example is one of the reasons I'm setting this stuff in South Africa. I want that as my base because it's a brick country. It's got a great constitution. The idea is everybody's meant to be equal further down the line, and that's exactly the same issue. They got legalization through a constitutional change, and that constitutional change is all about privacy. Again, that's fine if you're middle class and you've got a nice house and you can sit in your balcony, but if you're poor and you're black, excuse my French, you're fucked. You really are. And privacy doesn't apply, and you end up in prison. And that's the same to an extent here, in New Zealand, in a bunch of other jurisdictions. Now, everybody, when they first talk, they first talk about cannabis, they always throw in a bit of human rights and equity and people's rights, but they never let you buy a seed, or they never let you do homegrown unless you're lucky enough to live in ACT or a few other places.
Yeah.
And so really, they say it and they're lying as the words come out of their mouth, because there is no desire to allow citizens to grow cannabis at home, which for me would be the most basic start. So you want to have an industry, that's fine. You make stuff that's better than people. If you can grow a better lettuce in your greenhouse or out in your organic farm,
and you can grow lettuces 24/7, 365. But I should be able to grow a lettuce occasionally if I want to.
And if it's a bad lettuce, I'll buy your lettuce.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not fucking rocket. But
what about in the States? What about New York? Because I saw a lot of discussion in the States about how cannabis was going to be a vehicle for sort of reparations. Especially, it's bullshit. It hasn't happened.
It's
like licensing, promoting, African American communities, Latino communities. It's all bullshit. It hasn't happened.
I mean, there's people working really hard at it.
But it's not translating into the market. But it's not
really translating into the market. And if you look at the numbers, and I don't have them to hand, but there's been a lot of people arrested for cannabis possession in various states around the US over the last decade, in the tens of thousands still. And that certainly outweighs the amount of people being let out of prison or having although they have expunged a lot of prior cannabis convictions in various states. But that said, they didn't. It just saves them money. That's why they're doing it. And the reality is it saves them money by expunging this stuff, because they don't have to. Any of the leftovers don't have to go through the court system, and the court system is buggered up enough by cannabis on top of all the other problems it's having. So I think it's generally bullshit. And I think this is. I've done this for 10 years, and this is why I'm doing this initiative thing and trying to get people to connect globally, because I don't think you can really change all these things at a national, provincial, state, city, council level until you just start at the top. And you have to literally change minds at the UN to introduce some sort of charter.
That's where it started, isn't it?
That's where the Americans put it.
That's where the Americans put it. It was a global phenomenon. We saw in the 60s, there was these global movements through the UN to regulate arms, drugs, these things that were deemed as bad, various political organisations and all the rest. And drugs were front and centre there. And really, it's been the big inhibition. We really do need someone raising it. Is that a possibility that we like?
Well, I don't know, but I've watched for the last 10 years, waited for somebody to do something, and I've watched with the UN in terms of various groups. You could call them activists, you could call them organizations, you could call a whole range. They all go alone from a particular jurisdiction normally and wave a piece of paper, and they say, just leave that piece of paper with it. We'll have a look at it later. We'll get back to you. And if you study these various commissions and sets of people at the UN, it's a bit like, sorry, I know you remember, but over the road, people are in and they don't want to leave because they get free air travel. They get they look important in their own country. So you really, and most of the people who get appointed to these boards or committees essentially have a prohibition view of cannabis.
What about the EU? Because we're seeing significant movement there. We've got Germany moving.
But Germany has moved without the EU, really. And the lawyers I speak to in Germany.
Is there pushback like from other? Because
there's no progress.
There's just no progress.
It's Brussels.
But like you often hope that a big jurisdiction, biggest economy, biggest country in Western Europe moves. Germany moves. Does that mean that with their single currency and their sort of homogenous?
I'm a bit negative about that at the moment, because
you don't think France or Britain will move?
No, I'll come to that in a second. But with Germany, there was all this excitement, but it's going through the same process as everybody else. There's a wonderful newsletter, the German Cannabis Business Association. I really suggest, if you want to know what's happening in Europe, you subscribe to that. It mainly talks about Germany, but they're very good at researching, much better than me, what they do. And you can see all the pushback at all level of federal in Germany, and then state-based, and then the courts. Brussels, those who are aware, are just letting Germany argue with themselves at the moment. I think the only thing that would change Brussels if suddenly ruling parties in Germany, Spain, Italy, France all got together and said we need to do something about that. That's never going to happen. The only way, again, that I think the EU is going to pay attention is if the scheduling, the one step above at the UN is changed, and then they will choose to ignore it for 5 years because that's how, we all know with UN rules and regulations, jurisdictions just go, I like that one. Refugees is a perfect example. I don't like being nice to refugees. So I'm just going to ignore those conventions. Yep. But I do love what they say about cannabis and drugs because we don't want those evil things. So they're fantastic. We're going to enforce those as much as possible
in our local statutes. What about the states, though? Okay, so the UN driven, so a big driver of what happens in terms of the UN's agenda. What's happening in the States? There were noises before the election, Trump coming out and saying, "Look,
bullshit.
It was all bullshit."
I mean,
and the Florida referenda failed just by a couple of percent. What was it? 65% they needed. They just missed out.
Yeah, and then truly,
is there any pushback in the States? Are the religious right pushing back? Because I mean, let's talk about the US and say North America, Canada. Okay. How big is the recreational adult use market, medicinal cannabis market in the States in terms of money? Is it too powerful, too big now to be put back in its box? Is there any political, cultural pushback, or is it potentially just going to be nationwide in a decade and then potentially something the US does take to the UN when they want to export, like when they go,
that's the big question. So, I mean, there's so many moving parts in that question. Firstly, let's start with this administration. Nothing's going to happen in this administration unless he thinks he's going to make a huge sum of money. But he knows, and his family knows, by just doing a Truth Social post like he did about CBD 7 weeks ago.
Yeah, I saw that.
Somewhere in that organization, somebody will have made money that makes him money. I think that is really the thinking of this administration is if we can make money out of it, we will, but we've got a far right in the House, especially the lower house, who don't really want it. So it's balancing how we make money and not really doing much about it federally. And I think a hint of that is what McConnell has just done with hemp. McConnell let hemp in, and McConnell, I'm taking hemp out. And so it's American politics. You've got the Senate, you've got the lower house, and then you've got the administration. And between those three at the moment, there's no desire. And on the other side of that argument, there is a desire from the GOP because they're really big on states' rights. So let's get rid of that headache and let states deal with it. I suppose they haven't really thought, well, they get enough tax revenue as it is federally to not spend more money to get it more efficiently. Does that make sense? Mm. So I think, they will let states rise and fall on their own cognizance, but I don't think any GOP administration is actually going to, force the change with a vote in both of the houses.
What about then looking at the states and the states' rights in the US? Where often what filters down to lawmakers here in Australia is, and it's very frustrating. Is look, there's been this liberalisation of laws, drug laws generally in the states, and they often, you were talking about Portland, they often talk about Washington State and Portland and how there was this liberalisation and it's been this spectacular failure, and now there's this big pushback and they're going to wind up. What is happening?
The level of knowledge in Australia about what is happening in American states is paltry, to say the least. Bullshit would be a better word. And people,
but they still seize upon it. And I've raised it in Parliament, and I say, look, we've got, scores of states that have legalized, and they go, oh, well, but, something's happening in Portland that's really bad.
Well, I'll tell you,
and
that's a specific issue. So they legalized cannabis, and then in 2017, was it 2018, because of the it's all about nuance. Because of the homeless problem, and I lived there at the time, so the whole place looked like a Steinbeck camp as I'd drive the kids to school. Because of the homeless problem in Portland, there was a big drugs problem. Why there's a homeless problem in Portland? Because they're so strict on it in California, all the homeless people move up from California to Portland. And obviously a large percentage of homeless people in the US have some sort of substance abuse problem. They thought the best way to deal with that would be to do a slightly larger version of what they did at Kirkton, is create an environment where people could, if they were going to use drugs, they were going to use them safely because they were dying. Like, you'd see them dead on the streets. It was awful. So they did
this
that.
Is prescription drugs.
Yeah, well, it's a range of everything. It's nothing to do with cannabis at all. And then so they decided to say, okay, we're going to legalize everything. But this happened in a period where a lot of pressure from DC was put on Oregon to stop doing that, because otherwise they'd take the money away, just like he is with all these other states on a whole range of reasons at the moment. So they sort of, obviously in the short term, the problem got worse in the city centre of Portland, and therefore it looked like the end of the world, or one of those Hollywood movies where everybody's walking around like zombies, which it was for a while. But to be honest, it was a bit like that before. And so that now they've repealed that, and it's actually even worse now they've repealed it, because obviously homeless people who have come from Arizona living under a train aren't going to be up with the latest legislative, developments in the assembly in Portland. So, that has nothing to do with cannabis. Absolutely nothing to do. And anybody who introduces that either should do a bit more reading or is lying. And I think that's, this is the problem. There's people who don't want regulation of compound substances, drugs, whatever you want to call them, will use any trick in the book to keep the status quo. That goes back to, it is appalling for people's health. So in terms of looking at the US and understanding it, and again, this is why I'm doing this thing with Cape Town University, because I want to be able to at least... At the moment, there's nowhere you can just press a button and say, this is what it's like in Colorado, or this is what it's like in Alabama, because that's where the most sophisticated, there's a more sophisticated conversation in Alabama than there is in New South Wales. And, that should scare the shit out of people who live in this state, but it won't. So I want to create an environment, at least people can freely research primary, secondary, and commentary materials about regulation in all US states at the touch of a button. It's not going to happen immediately, because every state has some great ideas, and every state has some appalling ideas, and a lot of them in the middle are, they've had to come out of 100 years of prohibition, and everything's got to be perfect in 24 months. Life's not like that. If and America's got so many other drug problems as well. You can't fix the problem. And I mean, what's amazing?
It's an iterative process.
Well, it's a 30 to 50 year process to get it to something that looks normal. But what's interesting is we haven't really spoken about Canada, and that's a good thing in a way, because they just did it quietly. And what they're discovering in the system that they've created, which isn't perfect, is actually they've rolled back the black market, illegal market for cannabis a lot more than they expected to within a 7-year period. They were thinking, that's going to take us 20 years to do that. They've actually managed to roll some of those numbers back in 5 to 7 years.
Because we've seen it sort of flux. When you look at California, there was a legalization, but then heavy regulation, tax, and then people going back, over-regulated, then people moving back into the
badly educated legislators.
Yeah, badly educated legislators, people moving back into the black market who were legal growers because of regulation, state tax, all the rest, going back into sort of legacy growing and the rest, or people just trying to grow, as much weed as they can with 5 plants in their backyard. Shout out to the Mendo Dope Boys. what is Canada doing well that the United States hasn't done? What we can learn on? If the goal is to regulate it, to push back the black market, how is
as properly as they could at federal level. They let the provinces decide whether they wanted to control it or whether they wanted to have it as a semi-open market, and those are worked to so. But I think most importantly, and it sounds a silly thing to say, they made it boring. They made it boring. So kids don't get overexcited by it. So opposition politicians don't get overexcited about it. So
how do you do that? Restricting advertising,
just managing those in a sensible way. And look, the Canadians are good at doing that. They're very good at
being boring.
Yeah, being boring. They are very good at being boring, and Americans laugh at them for being boring. But that's what they've managed to do. They've managed to sort of knock the stuffing out of it being a really exciting. There's still things happening in Canada, which for instance, as I mentioned before, how they've made it nice and boring at home, but the flip side of that is politicians, administrators, regulators obviously have stayed very quiet about, whatever you got left over, just flog it to those people overseas, and we're not going to. But that's not a problem they can fix by themselves. That is only a problem that can be fixed when the UN decides that it's got to be a fair and equitable market around the world. So, the Canadians are just taking advantage of other people's stupidity, but at the same time, where they're smart, and this is what surprised me about the Kiwis, not in that reference, the Kiwis could be where the Canadians are now, with an amazing export market. They could be making loads of money out of Australians, and they could have everybody just be bored of it by now in New Zealand. They'd just go, whatever. There's some.
Yeah, this is like exporting cheese.
Yeah.
And this is one of the other points that you raised. You at the beginning there, you said it's an agricultural commodity.
Well, again,
and that's one of the angles that I've been trying to inform and educate my state legislature about the opportunities in terms of looking for new economies in our regional and remote areas. It's a vast bulk commodity.
I fully concur with you. Look, I was in Oregon when this all started. Oregon is very well known. It's a bit like New South Wales, Victoria. It's got wine. It's got very good weed. It's got a whole range of, and they understood immediately, let's make this an agricultural product with Oregon, rainbows and all. And it works really well. And they didn't have to build it and make it too big because they can sell what they have at a very high margin because it is that good. And I was sitting there in Oregon thinking that, and I'm looking at the really early discussions in Australia and thinking, this is like for Australia, it's the country that has the biggest opportunity for cannabis. Australia is really good at agricultural products. It's really good at exporting them, branding them and all this sort of stuff. And to then come here and see that agriculture wasn't even mentioned in the discussion. It was just, a bunch of people with money. Do you remember that period, 2017, 18, all these companies, they were just all stock market plays. They weren't actually.
Just pump and dumps.
Yeah, pumps and dumps, yeah. And it was just insane. You just thought, I can't believe it. I mean, in northern New South Wales, anywhere in this country.
Well, especially northern New South, Rainbow region. You know that Nimbin's the second most visited site in New South Wales, tourist destination.
Well, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, it's like the Opera House. People come to Australia and they essentially go, I want to see, go to the Opera House, get a photo, see a koala, and go to Nimbin, go to Byron Bay. Especially for young people, it's the world knows, respects and understands northern New South Wales. It's just built for it, the sort of provenance of that area.
And we go back to the 70s with all those Italian growers out west.
Yes.
And in northern Victoria. And they knew, they were agricultural people. That's why they grew it, because they could make,
I remember turning up in Griffiths and having an Italian farmer say, I was saying, how are you going out here? And he was growing melons, and he said, oh, look, I make some good money out of the melons, but it's the weed growing under the grapevines, and they trellised it underneath the grapevines. And just had some guys that got out from Thailand to help them with that. And oh my God, Yeah, that was great stuff. A great opportunity for agriculture. Now, look, it's very Eurocentric, West focused. You spend a lot of time. You're based in Jakarta. When you're not collating.
Well, this is where I'm really interested because.
Well, I want to ask you about that, because you do a lot of promoting of music, DJing. You're in Southeast Asia. What the fuck is happening with weed in Thailand and in Muslim countries? That's what I'm really interested about, because the breakthrough, that I often point to, is what happened in Thailand. They would hang you for it. Then it was as legal as onions. Then there was some pushback. Then pushback the other way. What's going on in Southeast Asia? And do you think there's any prospect of a Muslim nation like Indonesia flipping?
Well, a very interesting question. I'll start with Thailand because it's a different country to the rest of them.
Yeah.
Firstly, let's forget about Vietnam. They're very conservative. Nothing's going to change there. Thailand basically were very Thai. Let's just be laissez-faire, and they love a bit of capitalism. So the place went crazy. It was all based around politics, and the guy in charge loved it. The deputy didn't. Actually, no, the deputy did, and the guy in charge didn't. And now they've swapped round. Basically, it's a very Thai approach. They allow for everything to happen, realize, okay, it's getting a bit crazy. And again, this is the same story you'll see all over the world as this develops. It's not really because of the Thais, because all those idiots from my country, the UK, or
Russians
or my country, Australia, go in and do stupid stuff. We can get to the Russians and the Ukrainians in a bit in Bali. And so that, they have thought that the best way to deal with this is say publicly they're creating a medical environment. I think what they're really doing is they want to move more to understanding what it is as a herbal medicine, which they sort of know anyway. And they just really want to take the wind out of the sails of that private sector for tourism. It's still there. You can still go and do whatever you like, but they just don't want the news to be, getting over there, and they'll pull that back a bit, but they don't want to really destroy the cannabis economy that they've created, because it's
vast now.
Well,
I heard one of the biggest,
et cetera, et cetera.
One of the biggest lobbyists for when there was the pushback to criminalise it again or to make it a more like medical. One of the biggest lobbyists were the property sector, because there were so many retailers who were going, hold on, this has been our post-COVID renewal, and all of a sudden it was the property sector saying, hey, we're the landlords, we don't want to put out 6,000 retailers out on the streets.
If you see Bangkok and you see some of these other places, there's it's a good 30% of each street in the busy areas is now full of some sort of dispensary or another. And my experience of dispensaries is North America and Thailand. And in Thailand, I was really impressed by the way that they run them and operate them in terms of everything else they do with customer service, but also education. It was really balanced, far more balanced than I thought it would be. And all that scare factor that you see in media and stuff about, it's just not true. They really are taking it very seriously and want to make something positive. I think, because they want to be first off the mark in the region, which leads to these other countries.
Because Morocco's recently legalised medicinal cannabis, which is remarkable. Have they done it by statute, or
it's everything in Morocco goes through the king and whichever head of department, and how closely they're politically aligned to the king to make. So that's happened, but it's never going to happen in the same way it's happened in Thailand. I was in Morocco in June. Yeah, it's easy to pick up some hash, but you're not.
Is it?
Oh yeah.
Is it good hash?
Yeah. But I've been going to Morocco on and off for 30 years. So it's very nice hash. The Moroccan hash is always the best in my book. But you're not going to be going to some big, bright, shiny, full of lights dispensary anytime soon to do that. And the Moroccans will come down really hard on idiot tourists who start trying to come in and out. And not just the Moroccan authorities, but the amount that's being shipped out of the country. The other thing I do is I decided...
Because it's a huge source for European hash, always
30 tons go out a week, probably.
Yeah.
Probably.
But what's happened on the ground? Are they police? If you're a foreign tourist there and you get caught with half an ounce of hash, are you still gonna end up in jail?
Depends how many US dollars you've got in your pocket at the time. I think it's probably the best answer.
But on the street, it hasn't been liberalised for tourists.
No, not at all. I mean, you can walk through any of those cities, Marrakesh, Fez, Chefchaouen, pick up some weed, and if you smoke it quietly, aren't an idiot. But all the people selling the little bits to tourists, the police will know who they are. I mean, that's just how these systems work in these countries. And common sense works, but as soon as you stop using common sense, I would imagine I don't think they've got time really to lock you up. They can't be bothered with that. They just want you out of the country. Don't come back.
What about other Muslim nations? When you look at Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, huge users and not haram, in Islamic law. Well, sort of on the, maybe
everything's
not,
always on the
but certainly not alcohol, and big producers and users of some of the world's best cannabis. Can we expect those jurisdictions? I think Pakistan may have, is it legalised medicinal cannabis?
Well, they're talking about, so I would cut Afghanistan out of the conversation. Poor farmers will grow more weed once the Taliban realise that they can't afford to, they're trying to knock that out at the moment. But they've done it for thousands of years. They'll carry on doing it for thousands of years and feed it through Pakistan. Let's look at Pakistan first. Pakistan has been talking about it. They're talking about regulations, and they've set up an office to deal with it. Although, if I remember rightly, every time I try and find that office online, it's virtually impossible. So I would say in Pakistan, amongst the elites, and especially the military, because this is how all this stuff works, there are discussions, how can we manage, control, and make money from it? And you'll see from those private conversations, developments filter over the next few years. If we come across to Bangladesh, I know little or nothing about Bangladesh, but I can tell you northern India, which has a lot of Muslim politicians, there's a lot of discussion. Himachal Pradesh, there's a lot of discussion at the moment for the last 18 months, but I haven't seen much happen. What I find interesting is what's happening in Malaysia and Indonesia, of which people won't be aware here. Malaysia has been talking about a medical cannabis environment of some sort for 5 to 7 years now. They have, if I remember rightly, introduced some pretty basic ideas for legislation into Parliament. It hasn't really got very far. But the fact that they're having the conversation, and if they're having the conversation, they realize there has to be an end game. Something will eventuate. And because this conversation is happening in Malaysia, very timely you asked me, because my partner literally sent me something 2 days ago. A woman parliamentarian whose name I don't yet know, because I've got to do some research when I get back this week, has just stood up in Parliament and introduced, it's not a new idea, but it's a pretty new idea about a medical cannabis setup in Indonesia. And a bit like Pakistan, if you're doing something in Indonesia, it's all about, okay, which regions. So in Indonesia, the most famous region for growing weed is Aceh, which happens also to be the most conservative Muslim section. But they also need a lot of money. They just had that flooding this weekend. That's where lots of dreadful things happen. So there is a discussion happening in Indonesian politics, which is like politics anywhere. A high percentage of that discussion happens behind the scenes. And Indonesia will be the same. There'll be the Department of Health, there'll be various other government departments, there'll be the military, and then there'll be very powerful players in Aceh who will want to manage most of what happens. So we're at a very early discussion point. But if you're following Indonesian politics at the moment, I won't bore you, but they're really about engaging. There's a lot of engagement. They've seen what's happening in the US. They've seen the Russians. They've seen what the Chinese are doing. The Indonesians, who woke up a long time ago, have now decided that they really want to engage in a whole range of with a whole range of economies and parts of their economy with the rest of the planet. And it's moving very quickly. It's not reported very much. And I think we'll find that cannabis is part of that because it goes back to that they're good at agriculture. It's an easy product to make. There's a big export market for already. I don't think we'll see anything.
And also you've got a huge tourism industry.
Yeah, I'm not sure they'll be so keen on the tourism industry. Bali is telling them. So this is the other thing is that history about Indonesians and chopping off hanging or chopping off their heads or whatever people get excited about. The Indonesians are far more sensible in approaching the way that they deal with the sort of international approach to understanding. Sorry, what I'm trying to say is they've really cut back on really bad decisions on executing people. It's the simplest way to say. Well, if you follow,
I remember going to Malaysia in 1993 out of Thailand, and they had huge billboards, literally photos of people being hung. Like of dead bodies, and just saying,
So the Indonesians,
I was just making sure I'd gotten rid of my tin of, a little Thai stick going, oh my God.
Bali has become part of the international economy. It's full of very nasty people, very nasty places, doing very nasty things. And they know that they can't put them all in prison and get rid of them. So, and there's a lot of very stupid young people from here, from the UK, from the US coming in and getting involved in that. And what I've noticed, if you look at the courts recently, is they've threatened them with all the nasty stuff, but very quietly, 3 months later, they're put on a plane and sent home.
Yeah,
with don't come back again. They've got harder problems with Ukrainian and Russian mafias and other mafias working in Bali, and that's not really a central government Indonesian problem. It's more Balinese have decided that they want. They thought they could turn Bali into Ibiza without drugs, but if you want a whole lot of young people from around the world who are just used to getting on the phone and buying drugs, they're not going to come unless they can do all that stuff as well. So they're working their way through some issues that everybody else are at the moment. But I do think it's forced them into a discussion of understanding that they have to have what they decide, I don't know, but they have to have a discussion about this. And medical cannabis is a global discussion now. And it goes back to this thing. I could talk in detail about a whole range of jurisdictions, but none of them are going to make any decisions until scheduling is changed at the top. And the scheduling was initiated by the US, but it's not going to be uninitiated by the US. So it really needs to be a independent global coalition, I think, of lawyers, politicians, academics, some cannabis industry, but not too much, and health professionals, human rights professionals, who are used to dealing with the UN, have been for years and years, and know and understand how that organization works and creates a standard political strategy to initiate change, but it has to be global. There'll be some Indonesians aboard, there'll be some Ugandans on board, there'll be some North Americans, but it has to be an equal global approach to change those schedules. And that won't make all these governments fall over straight away, but it sets the tone. And I think what we've learned and what you've learned here in New South Wales in the past few weeks and what happened down in Victoria, you're not going to fucking change anything here until Mr. Minns and his like have to look up and say, oh, Daddy says now, maybe we should pay a bit more attention.
What if you can do both things at once? There's that movement at the top, and then at the bottom, in the ACT homegrown. That's our policy. Okay, before we have this mass market, and you've got to work out who owns it and the licensing and the advertising and the what retailing looks like if the medicinal market then turns into and like when you go down King Street in Newtown, there's 3 dispensaries now with the front open and it's like plant medicine, get your prescription, get your medicine today. It's pretty much retailing cannabis out of a shop front in the middle of King Street. And one of the things is a lot of people think that cannabis is legalised if you're middle class and you can, spend $150 on 10 grams. What about the homegrown, ACT? Is that a worthwhile process to continue to pursue? That we, like, while they're working out who owns everything and all the rest, we should just be able to grow.
For me, the most obvious thing, yes, you'd have a really simple bill that says you can grow 3 plants. But that's never going to happen because senior politicians always, they have to have the ear of people with large companies, money and power. And just like in the US, I presume in Australia, I'm not really interested in the cannabis industry and, your Montus and all these sorts of people who I'm sure have the ear of certain people.
Yeah, they're a big lobby group now.
But the bigger lobby group are the ones who have the serious money, this started in 2015 here, it was the mining companies. It's all those and all your whoever owns, I don't know, who owns Coles or who owns Woolworths or is like
Wesfarmers.
Wesfarmers, yeah, that's right. I just had this discussion with my son the other day and he told me it was Wesfarmers. Yeah, it's when Wesfarmers want to do this stuff. That's when it happens.
And if they've bought into Medcan and they're big in Medcan, they're not going to want to see they don't want people DIYing on there.
Because they're so greedy, they don't realise they'll actually make more money if they let people DIY, because most people will DIY, give up, and then go and buy shit afterwards.
What about the idea, one of the ideas that got floated in our cannabis inquiry that we had was non-enforcement zones. So you just create a Petri dish. Essentially, I call it, the Nimbin model, where you say in these local government areas, we don't change the law, but like there's lots of laws that we don't go and enforce. I think there's still laws on statutes where, you're supposed to run down the road in front of a car waving flags to warn all the horses. That there's an automobile coming. It's still on the books. We don't enforce it because we've moved on. What about non-enforcement zones? The Amsterdam model.
Well, I'm not a big fan because it equates cannabis with the sex industry as in Amsterdam. It equates in Nimbin. So interesting, I just went up to see Michael in Nimbin. I'd been there in the 90s. I took my son up for the first time, and he likes a little puff and all this sort of stuff, but he got to Nimbin. He just looked around and he just said, no. I think it creates little ghettos that create more problems for the future rather than less problems. Because you get that concentration of every, and a lot of use and misuse and all the social problems that come along. And people think it's a nirvana for them, or it's going to solve their lives. And then you concentrate all those issues in one place, and it just gives other people. Look at the state of Nimbin. They'll say, look at the state. They'll suddenly say they're Wagga, and then everybody's just going to pounce on Wagga, is going to open up with, false dispensaries, illegal, And if you look at that example, a perfect example of that actually at the moment is they're not really enforcing rules about psilocybin sales in parts of Canada. So various individuals have created retail fronts.
Yeah, I've heard this.
And there's one company particularly called Fun Guys, and I've been following them now for 3 years. I think he's English, but he's based in Egypt. It's all very opaque as always. But what it's done is it's created turf wars. They're burning each other's shops down. A bit like the tobacco
really?
stuff.
Over psilocybin?
Yeah.
Mushrooms?
Yeah.
Oh, mushroom wars.
Yeah, exactly. So if you look at the tobacco industry here, it doesn't apply exactly, but what it does is it creates the birth for these turf wars in particular places, and it drives people to spend money, so those turf wars get. And I just don't think it's either, for me at this stage, like itty bitty, because we'll give them a little bit. That's exactly what the big politicians, one of those bigger end of town politicians, we give them a little bit. Oh, look, it's awful. But let's close that down and let's not do it again.
Yeah.
So I think that's not the approach for me anyway. And again, I go back. I do think the only way now to approach this is you go right to the top and you change the top and you filter that change down through law. I don't think, letting councils say, you know what, we'll let you smoke weed in that park, but not that park, or it just doesn't work. I mean, I've just watched it over and over and over again. There's lots of people or lots of sections of the community who don't want it to work, so will work. It gives them a great excuse to say look at the state of those people. It's not going to work.
Well, Sean, that's absolutely fascinating and a great note to finish up on this discussion on what won't work and what does work. So I really appreciate the work you do to collate and curate not only your music, and you've got to check out Metal Postcard Records.
Oh, and also, if you would talk about music, we'll do another 3 hours. No, I won't, only joking. I have a great radio show I do every week on Mixcloud called Bottom of the Pops, the most unheard of music around and about every week. So tune into that.
Well, you're our own version of John Peel.
Thank you very much for saying that.
You definitely check that out, because there are some emerging artists there. The Shops from WA, I love them. They're a great band, and so promoting and getting that.
Well, can I give a shout out to a Sydney band who've been around for a while, but they very, very rarely get heard. GT from Sydney, and their absolutely superb track, I Hate Driving in the City, which is, if you haven't heard GT, they're one of the best Australian bands since the Radio Birdman. But as usual, they don't make their way to major culture. So I will shout them out time and time again.
Really important too, because there's a lot of barriers to young music, ideas getting out there. And we've got to remember that Triple J when it came out.
Best radio station in the world.
Yeah, it was, and it busted a lot of people like Birdman and, Midnight Oil and all these Australian bands, the Gurus, everyone.
You name them.
They changed, that changed Australian music and global music, led to, grunge and all the rest. That's a big rave. But you're promoting those, getting ideas, art out there from Australia, from around the world. Great, check that all out. And your podcast that you're doing on
the Karma Koala podcast.
Karma Koala podcast. We're a cross-pollinator here, and also the Cannabis Law Journal and Cannabis Law News, Cannabis Law Report. Sorry,
there is a lot of it, I know.
There's a lot of it, but if you want to understand what's going on globally, up to date, fantastic. And we'll keep an eye out for what's going on in South Africa, because that really is what we need, is to share information. So, Sean, thank you very much for the work you do. Thank you for being a provocateur and a pollinator of ideas. Really appreciate you continuing to share the good fight, to fight the good fight, get the good ideas out there, and coming on into the weeds, mate. Thank you very much,
Jeremy. Thank you very much for having me on the show, and it's been a pleasure, as they say.
Thank you.